Welcome to the Judgment Call podcast, a podcast where I bring together some of the most curious minds on the planet. Risk takers, adventurers, travelers, investors, entrepreneurs, and simply mind-bogglers. To find all episodes of this show, simply go to Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, or go to our website, judgmentcallpodcast.com. If you like this show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or subscribe to us on YouTube. This episode of the Judgment Call podcast is sponsored by Mighty Travels Premium. Full disclosure, this is my business. What we do at Mighty Travels Premium is to find the airfare deals that you really want. Thousands of subscribers have saved up to 95% in their airfare. Those include $150 round-trip tickets to Hawaii from many cities in the US, or $600 lie-flat tickets in business class from the US to Asia, or $100 business class lie-flat tickets from Africa round-trip all the way to Asia. In case you didn't know, about half the world is open for business again and accepts travelers. Most of those countries are in South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. To try out Mighty Travels Premium, go to mightytravels.com/MTP, or if that's too many letters for you, simply go to MTP, the number 4, and the letter U.com to sign up for your 30-day free trial. Find out what's kind of your pattern, what things really matter to you, and why does that happen, right? There's an endless amount of political topics we could talk about, from the ancient times all the way to what happened literally yesterday. Do we like Biden's speech or not? What I'm trying to find out is how people run that algorithm that they get involved, excited, so to speak, with one particular issue. And then it seems to be gone 2 months later, or 6 months later, or maybe never, right? So, but what is that topic that really excites them in that moment? And how do you think that's something that is a conscious decision you made, or it's someone else's decision that put this in your brain, so to speak, and you just didn't realize it? Like social media, right? Or maybe your friends, or maybe your church, or maybe it's some crazy liberals. I mean, which I fully agree with. They're crazy, right? I think
they're crazy.
But where does this actually come from? Why do we get excited about things and then we forget about them?
I think it comes out of identity, whether you have a well-formed identity or not. Like whether you have been thoughtful and intentional about cultivating specific character traits and values. And if you have done that work, and it's hard work, and you have been skeptical, you've been through a period of extreme skepticism where you've rejected a lot of the things that you initially were raised to believe, and then subjected them to radical doubt, and then perhaps readopted them freshly for yourself. You didn't just accept them and hold them continuously from the time of your youth on, but you rejected them and then them. I think that period of radical skeptical rejection is a period that the most enlightened minds always go through. It's kind of a hellscape of the soul that you have to trudge across to burn away all the stuff that doesn't necessarily hold up to logical scrutiny. You know, like we are raised with a lot of superstition and fairy tales and stuff like that from our childhood. And while it's good to cultivate imagination, just buying into that whole hog unquestioningly is not the hallmark of a rational mind.
I really like what you just said. What I feel is still perplexing to me is there's this enormous amount of potential topics we can choose from, right? And I don't think, and this is a list of thousands and thousands of topics that are important. This is how we develop the economy. How do we create fairness in the society? How do we run our justice system? So it's probably endless amounts of topics, right? But if you look at the daily chatterbox, so to speak, of Twitter and Facebook, there's a relatively limited amount of topics that actually seem to gain traction and create an emotional connection with people. And this is what the AI algorithms, what social media is really accentuating, is what the AI feels it can promote to the next user and get some engagement from. And I think, me included, we are not really aware that most of these topics are actually presented to us because they created an emotional reaction with other people. And that's why the algorithm thinks we will also emotionally react to this. And we also, I have trouble remembering what I saw on Twitter a couple of days ago. I might still, if I know the account, I might remember the account and there was something interesting, but that's about it. So what I'm trying to get at is we look at all these political issues and we feel very strongly in that moment, and maybe even a couple of weeks later, right? But there's so many more interesting topics that, in my mind, would frame the future of this country or the world, and are much more impactful. And nobody really cares about them. But you can talk about them on Twitter, but you get like 2 likes. And it doesn't matter who tweets them, right? It can be a very popular account. What we argue about these little things, you could obviously infer more important things from these little things, but it seems almost like there is someone consciously misdirecting us.
Yeah,
that's what
I
I'm
agree
trying
with
to
that.
get at.
Yeah, I think
And
the
maybe
social media algorithms are definitely designed to stir up hype first and foremost, because that's what draws attention, and what draws attention draws ad revenue. So we have to understand that these are advertising companies. That Facebook is an advertising company. Twitter is an advertising company, and if you're not buying it and you're not selling it, then you're the product being sold. That's what people don't realize, they don't see, that if you're not buying it and you're not selling it, you are the product being sold. Data or advertising impressions are the product. And so whatever pulls data out of you, whatever pulls engagement out of you, any kind of data points that they can get, no matter what they are, then that's something that they want to get out of you. So they will provoke you as often as possible to do that. And then whatever will draw you in to engage with the content and the platform and keep you there longer, trap you there longer, so that they can put as many ads in front of your face, they'll do that too. That's a horrible formula. That's like a toxic, narcissistic friend that constantly talks about themselves and everything they're interested in and doesn't really listen to you. And then when you do speak, they're only listening for something that they can use to hook you and redirect you to somebody else and something else that they have an ulterior motive and some kind of agenda to push. And if Facebook was a friend, like if Facebook was a girlfriend or a boyfriend, if Facebook was your spouse, would you divorce them for that way? Would you not speak to, would you like ghost that friend for treating you that way? Of course you would. If Facebook was a person in your life, a human in your life, and they acted the way Facebook acts towards their users, you would hate that person. And yet we trust Facebook with our logins, our accounts, our data, our family pictures. And I'm as guilty as everybody. You know, I'm on there because my grandmother's on there, you know, and I want to make sure that she can see, you know, the family pictures and, you know, what's going on. It's her windows to the world. Same thing with just about every social media company. We use them because they're convenient ways to talk to other people, but they insert themselves in an intrusive way in those relationships, and then they make themselves inextricable, and they do it all for these very devious motives. I kind of want to go back, if I can, for just a second to the point that you asked me about before, like why people are kind of the way that they are.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a quote by Confucius. He said, "At 15, I set my heart upon learning. At 30, I had planted my feet firm upon the ground. At 40, I no longer suffered from perplexities. At 50, I knew what were the biddings of heaven. At 60, I heard them with a docile ear. At 70, I could follow the dictates of my own heart, for what I desired no longer overstepped the boundaries of right." It took him 70 years, in other words, basically the whole lifespan of a person, to finally restrain his own passions and develop a character that he could be proud of. That's a lifelong endeavor is what he was really saying, but it's a process. And then there are certain milestones along that process where you'll see progress. But a lot of people never at 15 set their heart upon learning. lifelong commitment to learning and personal development is not for them. They don't care about that. They just want to have a good time. And if they are those good time folks, they'll peak early, and they won't leave a legacy. They won't have a huge impact on others. They will live a selfish existence, and that's the difference.
I like your comparison that you made as a psychopath friend on social media. That's I think very well put. And I think the majority, I think, of users in the US are finally waking up to this. One is this intrusion of privacy, and then the other side is that it is nothing healthy that comes out of these algorithms. And again, this can be fixed, right? So there is a model for a conscious and a useful friend that could be social media. The question is, can they make enough money with this? And it is the corporate culture that these companies have. Is that compatible? And when you watch The Social Dilemma, it is almost like recovering criminals. Well, when you see former executives of these companies, so they know they had a conscience, and then it bothered them for years, but they made a lot of money. They made bundles of money. And then eventually when they were rich, they got out, right? So they didn't get out on the first day when they realized what's going on. They got out when they were rich and they could exit their stock options. But you feel this is laying on them. It's definitely a weight. And that is a really strange development, because Silicon Valley didn't really start out that well. It started out as a kind of more hippie-ish idea of democratizing access to knowledge. At least that was the big overtone. It got very commercial in the 90s. But I think in the early days, there was a lot of goodness to it. And I think we see that the internet has really delivered on this. But there's been...
Believe that?
And
do you believe that?
Sorry.
Can I just ask, can I just jump in and ask, do you believe that really, or are you willing to entertain the idea that perception could be attributed to some historical revisionist PR on the behalf of the...
No,
I mean, because like,
I was involved in it.
I think they looked...
I met a ton of people who had exactly that mindset. And now you can say, oh, well, that depends on the time frame.
At the top.
These people are still around. And maybe they are just a minority. They were never the majority. You could make that argument. But there was a strong movement that was actually driving a lot of those forces. And then obviously, I blame it on VCs, right? VCs give you so much money, and you say, well, it's great, right? Why wouldn't I take a couple of million? And then you put them to your business, and 12 months later, they say, well, but now we need to have 10 times the amount of users. And you're like, what? And then you go somewhere where you don't really want to go. And then they say, well, you did it last year. So it's a bit like a criminal gang, so to speak. You know, they force you to do something illegal, and then they hold it against you the rest of your life. And I feel it's more of a conscience on the VCs, but their hands are clean, right? They never got their hands dirty. That would be my explanation.
Well, the money's... Yeah, I think that's true. But again, remember the Pareto principle that 80% of results come from 20% of causes. So even if 80% of the people in Silicon Valley had the kind of peacenik hippie, change the world for the better mindset, and they're your boots on the ground engineers, the functional people who work in the business and make things happen, the 20% of people actually driving 80% of the outcomes might not be those people. It might be the other 20% of the people involved in the business who are, at the top in the power structures, the CEOs, the CTOs, COOs, who may have an agenda that's more selfish, more profit centered, a stronger profit motive. And of course, nobody really wants to be aligned with just profiteering, regardless of the impact on society. Nobody wants to be seen in that way. So they have a powerful incentive to retroactively, massage the narrative around what they've done and make it seem like the culture of Silicon Valley is, very enlightened, when in fact it's just free market capitalism, which is great. Free market capitalism is great, but you can't do free market capitalism without some really fundamental awareness that that's the game you're playing. Capitalism gets dangerous when you're playing that game under false pretenses. When you think that you're doing something not for profit but for good, then you will be easy to dupe. And people who are there and who make no bones about being there for profit, they're going to see an advantage and they're going to take it because that's what you do.
Yeah,
not
but
here to demonize
I
it.
feel
I'm just observing.
it is a problem of time horizon. So there's a short-term
Mhm.
optimization graph and there's a long-term optimization graph. Duping your users and being just a psychopathic friend is not going to give you a long-term result. As a girlfriend, boyfriend, as a spouse, or as a company, it's just not going to end well. And you know that, but you still might go for it because you feel that's the best solution for you. And I think this is okay. It's just people need to recognize this. And I always say that, we've been living in the civilization and cities for so long, but still we seem to have a stable amount of psychopaths in our society, of criminals. That criminal behavior should be, you can say, eradicated, right? Because we genetically select the next the next generation as to be one that fits right into society, that has made their life, was able to live their life very properly in that society. So I feel like
Let's
these
be
things
clear.
are necessary of
Let's be
a
clear about
healthy
one
society.
thing.
We just need to develop we need to get away from this naivete that a lot of people have. So we need to see society as it is.
I agree with that. But I want to clarify. And we're very cavalier about how we toss around terms like psychopath or narcissist. I mean, I kind of use that term or introduce that term to the conversation, and so I need to take ownership of that. But when I talk about someone being a narcissist or a toxic narcissist, that's very different from being a psychopath. Being someone who's a psychopath or a sociopath, which those terms aren't really clinically used anymore. The term is now antisocial personality disorder, or in Europe, dissocial personality disorder. Someone who's actually struggling from that actual psychological condition is not necessarily a bad person. In fact, the world needs psychopaths. The world needs sociopaths.
Absolutely agree.
Some of your top performing CEOs, doctors, lawyers, politicians, some of the people who are like driving society forward are, they fit the criteria for these diagnoses, and they often go undiagnosed because they don't run afoul of the law. And people with antisocial personality disorder and dissocial personality disorder get a really bad rap because there's a disproportionately large percentage of the prison population that also fits that diagnosis. And so we sort of lazily associate these conditions with being a criminal or being a bad person, when in fact what they really are is the alphas of society. They're the alpha predators of society, of the human population. And humanity, just like every other species, needs alphas, and we should not demonize them. So I really think that actually it sounds counterintuitive to say, and it's not socially acceptable, and it's probably social suicide to say this, but it's the truth, that we owe a lot of our species development to what we would call, in a cavalier way, sociopaths, and we need to stop demonizing that diagnosis.
I fully agree with you on that point, and I think it's a marker for how much.
But you got to watch them, right? Because they are predators. I mean, they are the alphas, so. Yeah.
It's a marker of how much risk people are willing to take, and it's obviously, there is a deeper reason why these behaviors are part of pretty much any society you go in the world, or every single society. You can go to Papua New Guinea and you will find the same behaviors in a certain amount of people. So there is something to it, and I think we can talk it away with some theory where we feel, well, this is a negative behavior and we should suppress it. I think we absolutely agree on this.
I think it's just about accountability, because sociopaths, like anybody, they respond to incentives. They're very rational people. And in fact, that's probably the primary difference between what we would call a sociopath and everybody else. Everybody else tends to respond more strongly to empathy, to feelings. They're emotionally driven. Whereas someone who we would consider a psychopath or a sociopath is someone who is a more logical, less empathetic, less feelings-driven person. But just because they're driven less by feelings doesn't mean they're driven less by incentives. So when we have the right incentives in the relationships in society, and when we structure incentives appropriately, and we make it clear that there's accountability, that if you do good things, you'll be rewarded. If you do bad things, you'll be punished. Then I think people who are psychopaths that actually have good impulse control which weak impulse control is part of the classic diagnosis for antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, sociopathy. But there are a lot of people who are on that spectrum, and it's a spectrum, who do have good impulse control. And the ones with good impulse control will be phenomenal people, but you do have to structure their incentives appropriately. It's all about incentives for me, anyway.
Well, I can see A, the knowledge that you have in that field, and you must have clearly thought about that, and B, how specific you are with the terms, which I guess is part of your habit and part of your profession, right? So you run your legal professional office in Nashville, which often is associated with a higher degree, and that's probably an image, and just like an image that people have in their mind, but it's associated with a higher degree of individuality. If I think of cities in the US, and I think of high individuality, I would think of many cities in Texas. I would think of Nashville. That would come to mind, and I think this shines through with what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? There would be no Texas without Tennessee.
Yeah.
and I love to remind my friends in Texas of that. There would be no Texas without Tennessee. They would be part of Mexico without Tennessee. And so I think that they're sister states, that they definitely. There's a strong cultural affinity between Texas and Tennessee. You look at a city like Austin, Texas, for example, pretty liberal city, just like Nashville is a pretty blue city in an otherwise red state. Memphis and Knoxville also pretty blue cities. And if you look at the state flag for Tennessee, it's a red field with a blue circle and 3 white stars. And I always consider Nashville and Knoxville and Memphis to be sort of blue stars on the otherwise red background of the state. So they're pretty progressive, and Austin is like that as well. It's a pretty progressive city, but they both have the arts in common. There's a lot of music. Nashville's called Music City, USA. That's what it's known for. The Grand Ole Opry was there. It's the home of country music. And it's just sort of like the hub for a lot of historically music and art and everything in this part of the country, at least. You've got some other really art-heavy cities like Asheville, North Carolina, and then of course, New York is a haven for the arts. San Francisco, Miami, for different types of art. But in the South, and especially for country music and things that are popular here, Nashville is really the hub of all of that. And I think people come here for the same reasons they go to LA. They come here to make it. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine who's the executive director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and she was talking about the mental health work that they're doing in Davidson County, where Nashville is, and she was talking about how many people come to them for help because they came to Nashville to make it as a musician, as a singer-songwriter, and they didn't. It's a tough industry. It's hard to make it, and then when they don't make it, they encounter issues like depression, substance abuse, and so on. Not to mention all the financial struggles that a struggling artist can have. So Nashville, you're right. It's a very independent city. It's like a place like LA where you can go and make it big, or you can go and wait tables. It's the old running joke about actors in New York, or stage actors in New York and film actors in LA. It's the same thing in Nashville. So yeah, it's a very individualist city. You're right.
I live in San Francisco, and we had the big exit out of California, especially San Francisco. We lost a huge amount of people. The estimates are somewhere between 30 to 50% of people who actually had something to do in the city of San Francisco. So they commuted from nearby cities. And Nashville, Austin, Miami are typically the choices for most people that would exit the city. Very often they would go back home to their parents if they're young enough. Otherwise, they would just move their family to one of those destinations. And there's other places, but those were certainly the prime suspects. And one of the things that a lot of people mentioned, and I'm not sure how much that fits in, and there is obviously the political debate, and California, and especially the cities in California, are terribly run. It's basically like an anarchy. There's a lot of virtue signaling on a political level, but there isn't any anything goes. There's very little things that actually get enforced in San Francisco. I think there's parking and maybe some violent crime. Everything else is it's basically open to anyone who is here. There's no parole. You basically the DA basically refuses to prosecute anything. We're very strange places, homeless people everywhere, and they're being ignored. They're not being helped, but they're also not being hassled. So everything goes, anything goes. And
I saw that Oakland is going to start paying, I think this is an unconstitutional and racist policy, by the way, but they're going to start making $500 payments, no questions asked, to low-income families, but only people of color. So they're actually using racial discrimination to determine who gets publicly funded funds, like government money, taxpayer money is going to be redistributed to people, no questions asked, for basically a universal basic income, but it's race-based. And I think that's a horrible precedent. It's a horrible principle. It's a racist principle.
It won't survive. It will won't survive in that way. I mean,
I think it's unconstitutional.
Right? So, I think everyone agrees, but it's Oakland. It's more, they put out these policies. It's 90% virtue signaling. It will probably never happen because you don't have the money for it. I do think there is a lot of good with UBI. Well, one argument that I wanted to make before we go into these specifics is, and you said that earlier with people going to Nashville and going to LA and they're trying to make it. And I think this is a very American thing, and this is a wonderful thing, right? There's probably only good things on average that come out of it, even if it doesn't work out for a lot of individuals. But if you see social media and if you see how the world has already transformed itself in the last 10 years, what I sometimes feel is that the expectations of what defines success have been going up so much, especially in cities that are more open, that are more cloudified, so to speak, where more people think in these terms of social media and the way they think the world should run. So they raise their own expectation of what defines success, and everything else is a frustrating failure. And there's only so many actors that we need that are really famous, right? So maybe it's 1,000 people, maybe it's 5,000. It's a relatively small number. We can say the same for country singers. Nobody can listen to 100,000 country singers and make them famous. It's just not possible. We can listen to them, but they wouldn't be famous. What I feel like everyone wants to be famous, that was true before, right? But people always felt that was a special thing where they needed to be super lucky and they need to take a huge risk. But relatively few people went for it. And now, because of social media, or because whatever it is, everyone wants to be not just famous. When you look at young people, they all want to be YouTubers. They all want to be, on TV, or they want to be actors. It seems like these expectation levels, what happened is we put this huge depression on ourselves, because right now we can't really fulfill the expectations we have of ourselves and of our friends.
I agree with that, but I think that that's a symptom of a deeper problem, and it's the deeper problem is a lack of awareness in two major fields that just are not effectively taught in school. One is philosophy. There's virtually no critical thinking that's being taught in a systemic and meaningful way throughout the public school system. We don't teach philosophy in public schools, and philosophy comes from two Greek words. It's actually a compound word, philo and sophia, right? Philo is love, and it's specifically the kind of love that the Greeks referred to as brotherly love. It's the love of a brother, like the love of a relative, philo, and sophia, which is the Greek word for wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. How can we not love wisdom? How can we value anything more than wisdom? Wisdom is what lets us make good choices. Philosophy is all about making good choices. And what should we be teaching children in schools, if not how to make good choices for themselves? The fact that we're not teaching philosophy is an egregious oversight. But if we teach critical thinking, then people will start to critically think about the government. They will start to ask themselves, is this a good policy? Does this person really have my best interests at heart? Do they just want my vote? Are they using me? And those are uncomfortable questions for politicians who control the publicly funded school system and use it to indoctrinate children generation after generation into a two-party system that has no one's best interest at heart. So it's no wonder the way education is structured that we don't teach philosophy, but it's because we don't teach philosophy that people make stupid choices, they make bad choices, they make choices against their own self-interest because they're not taught how to love wisdom. And then the other field that needs to be taught is economics. Economics is the science of human decision-making. It's the reverse side of the coin of philosophy. Philosophy teaches you about meaning and value and purpose, how to critically think, how all of that works and what your values should be. But then economics is the mechanics of all of that. It's the engineering to the theoretical physics, right? It's how to put all of that into practice. Economics starts with a single simple principle, and that principle is that incentives matter. And when we look at the incentives that we, respond to in our behavior, whether they're social media companies or government, I mean, it's literally everything that you're talking about. All of these various issues, they are boiled down to really two deficiencies in society: a lack of wisdom and a lack of love for wisdom, so poor philosophy, and a lack of understanding about how human beings make decisions, the science of human decision making. And I would recommend 2 books to start your journey to solving these deficiencies in your own life, no matter who you are. And the first one is Ideas Have Consequences by Richard M. Weaver. This book is fundamental, I think, for every person. I think if you can get a copy of this and read this, I can guarantee you it will change your life. And then the other one is Common Sense Economics by Dr. James Courtney and a number of other economists. There are several authors, but it's Common Sense Economics. Both of these books are very easy to read at an 8th grade reading level. Any person can read them. Any person can get a lot out of them, guaranteed to change your life. And they're just really, really good. The economics book, Common Sense Economics, talks about economics generally. It talks about economics and good government. And it also talks about economics and personal finance. So there are, 3 main divisions of that book, and every single part of it is useful. And I think if more people took the path like Confucius, right, of setting themselves to a lifelong commitment to learning and personal development, and they started with these 2 books and then built on and built on and built on with related reading, they'd have better outcomes in their lives. They wouldn't be so depressed because they wouldn't be spending all their time on Instagram looking at fake people and their fake lives that, they're just showing you the highlights, right? It's like reading the news but never reading the articles, only reading the headlines and letting yourself get all worked up about it emotionally. It's the same way with social media. When we look at someone's Instagram feed, we're literally seeing the high points of their life that they personally selected and curated to brag, to say, look at how great my life is. Look at where I'm visiting. Look at where I'm traveling. Look at what I'm eating. Look at what I'm wearing. And they're literally broadcasting the best, but they never show themselves on Instagram in their darkest hours. They don't show themselves without makeup or when they're down or when,
I think that's a new trend. People actually transpose that. That's another new trend. I think you're absolutely right with a lot of these remarks. And one thing that I would say that but we have to keep in mind to moderate that. It's one thing to feel like we should teach philosophy and economics, and I'm fully with you. That's one of the 2 things that probably don't get enough exposure in most classrooms. But on the other hand, I was exposed to tons of philosophy when I was 17, 18, 19. I read Hegel, I read Kant, I read Schopenhauer. You know what? I couldn't understand it. I mean, I could understand the words, right? I could understand what they are trying to say, but I couldn't find a connection that made sense to me because I didn't have the life experience. And that's not about IQ. There's just...
Or a teacher. You need a teacher. It's like, how can people learn if there's no one there to teach them?
But I'm not saying we shouldn't teach it. I'm just saying the expectation that people understand what's in these books, I think it's relatively rare. That doesn't mean we shouldn't teach and try. But why give up before we try? No, I mean, I'm with you. But my expectation would be there is relatively few that actually sticks. Now, I picked it up later on again, and then I fully understood it, or like partially, and I definitely didn't fully understand it. but it helped me to have this prior knowledge and then just build from it. So it is a shortcoming, and the question is why, and maybe you know the answer to this. We see these shortcomings of people developing in ways that we feel are strange looking at them, right? And we say, well, the schools might play a big impact, and I think we have the school system that prepares students for a situation that was normal 50 or 100 years ago, but the work environment has changed, the learning environment has changed, and
100%.
It's a bureaucratic institution, so it changes not at all unless we really force it to. But before that, all the failing institutions go woke for a while, right? So that seems to be when your business model fails, you go crazy woke, and then you fail anyways. That seems to be true in journalism, seems to be true for colleges, seems to be true probably for schools at some point. And I think this change is underway already. But why do you think, do we see this major societal change if I come from a different country and I land in the US? I already know everything about the US political debate, which is odd, because 20 years ago, nobody really cared. There was a little bit of that, but not that deep. And second, if you land here, you feel like, whoa, this place is ideologically on fire. There's so much change going on, or at least people are abstracted out. They feel like there could be a big amount of change coming on both sides, or you can say there's hundreds of different sides. Why do you think does it happen now? Why do you think we didn't have this debate 40 years ago when there was actual communism on the other side that we could have used as a template?
Well, I think there's still actual communism. I think it may not be overt, and there may be a lot of lip service paid to the death of socialism, the death of communism, the death of Marxism. I think that's premature. We're declaring victory against Marxism prematurely because you're starting to see a large resurgence of that. As authoritarianism increases, so does the attraction, the allure for authoritarians of Marxist policies. I mean, authoritarianism and Marxism always go hand in hand, whether it's, fascist socialism or nationalist socialism or communism or some other version of Marxism, but they're all the same. They're all just variations on cancer. It's like they're all cancer. One's liver cancer, one's lung cancer, one's brain cancer, but they're all cancer. So I mean,
I like your comparisons.
You just need a healthy dose of radiation to kill it all. But why is that the case? I think it's because we're in the information age. I heard a guy say not too long ago, or maybe I read it in a book. It's all a blur, but he said, if I emailed you the plans for a B-2 bomber, it would get lost in your email inbox. Like, information you can't sell information anymore. People aren't willing to pay for information because they're awash in it. There's just more information than anybody can handle. And I think that's part of it, is that we have the Library of Alexandria at our fingertips and then some. And I think people get emotionally stirred up partially because of the media intentionally stirring up emotion and hype. I think social media companies do the same thing, and they do it for the same reason. They have a profit motive to do so. And most people are not aware of that. They're not hip to it. And they are at an identity level, at a core identity level. A lot of people are invested in labels. They're fans of things. And what is a fan? It's short for fanatic. They are fanatics about things. They obsessively collect material possessions that are branded, whether it's Gucci bags or Louis Vuitton or Star Wars paraphernalia or Star Trek stuff or whatever, right? Like, people are collectors. They're trying to fill the holes in their lives with stuff, this materialism, and then also they're ideological hoarders as well. What are the two big brands? I mean, it's Republican politics and Democrat politics. As someone who has for at least a decade, I can't remember exactly when I shifted out, but I think it was probably at the end of the first Bush administration. I really solidly became a libertarian, not a capital L libertarian, not the Libertarian Party, but a lowercase L libertarian, where I'm just not a joiner. I'm not ideologically aligned with anybody. I think we should treat every human being with charity, compassion, understanding, all of that, right? But I also don't buy into the whole woke thing. I'm not woke at all. I'm versus like woke people. I'm basically comatose. I have no wokeness whatsoever. I don't speak the vocabulary. I don't find any of that valuable, because what they're all looking for is not just tolerance, but validation, acceptance. Like, I have to say to a person who's woke, what you're saying is true for you. And I don't believe in true for you. I don't believe in personal truth. I think that there's truth, and then there's every person's individual subjective experience of that objective truth. And I'm not going to say, oh, well, that's true for you, because I think that that's not true. I think that you have a perception, I have a perception, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. And I don't want to be coerced or forced into saying something that I don't personally believe is true. And I think that that's what woke culture mandates and requires. And that's why I think it's dangerous. I think it's ideological authoritarianism run amok for what they perceive to be virtuous purposes. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So even if they have the best of intentions, I think their methodology is cancer. I think it's horrible.
Yeah, there's a lot to this new phenomenon, and I think we agree generally on the tenets, how wokeism and many parts of it are something pretty nasty, but it's wider than this. And I think people associate it with postmodernism, which doesn't seem to be so right. Then people associate it with Adorno, which is probably more right, but this guy is really old. And I'm really surprised, and nobody's really given me a good answer. Lots of this stuff has been around for a long time and has been debunked and has been rejected by pretty much any country on the planet. Weirdly enough, all of these ideas come out of Germany, so I feel really guilty. There's
that's the German way to feel really guilty. Like after World War II, that's all Germans seem to be allowed to feel is guilt, and you guys need to forgive yourselves, man, because you're not part of that old.
No. I'm joking, but there's a lot of really nasty intellectual stuff that came out of Germany, and Karl Marx was a German,
and Nietzsche, who ironically died of syphilis. I mean, the most appropriate end of any human being ever, right? Like Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes.
Yeah,
But he isn't as dark. I think people make it darker than I feel what he actually wrote. But obviously he was on a different scale of intelligence and arrogance.
Yeah,
so
that's true. Yeah, arrogance for sure. Yeah.
But what really surprises me is, why does this stuff come up now, and what's wrong that it gets so many followers? So clearly these people must be unhappy with what's currently going on. And I trace this back to the lack of opportunities. I've traced this back to the race of expectation, but on the other hand, there's very few opportunities. So in many coastal areas, for a young person to find a job and something that makes enough money consistently, not just for a month or two, to raise a family is almost impossible. Even paying rent is almost impossible. And now you can say, oh, well, you can always go to another place in the US, and I think this would work.
Or start a business.
People, this is not, you start a business. But even the opportunities to start a business, I think there is they're still better than anywhere else on the planet in the US, but they're more limited than it was 15 years ago or 25 years ago. Although we have more access to information, should have gotten easier. But to really extract money out of those is really tough. It's not impossible, but people should. But on any chance, I encourage people to do this, because the self-fulfilling prophecy, A, and B, is more entrepreneurs we have, they generate opportunities. It's not a zero-sum game. They have more opportunities for other entrepreneurs. But it seems like there's a lack of opportunities, and people can feel that they can relate to, that they can discover for themselves, and they get really pissed. And I think that's why we see
you're in California.
Extreme positions now.
You're in California. You're living through. Yeah, so you're living through the result of overregulation. What is it? What happens when your government tries to take on regulation of every aspect of life? They choke the life out of business. They tax their people to death. What happens? People respond to those negative incentives. When you tax something, you get less of it. When you subsidize something, you get more of it. It's fundamental. It's like gravity. What goes up must come down. Fundamental laws of economics that will never change, because like my grandmother, who's 100 years old, my grandmother says, what I've learned in my life is that times change, but human nature never changes. This is a woman who she was born in 1920, right? So she saw things go from living with her family of 6 plus her parents and her grandmother in a farmhouse with no running water and no electricity to putting a man on the moon, and she's now on her third. You know what I mean? Like she's seen the civil rights movement, she's seen World War II, she's seen the Vietnam War, she's seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, she's seen the fall of capitalism, she's seen like the 90s, the World Trade Center attacks. Like she's lived through all of this. Her mind is still sharp, and she's telling me, I've lived 100 years, times change, human nature never changes, never. And that's why economics doesn't change. And that's why when you tax something, you'll always get less of it. So when you tax income and you tax productivity and you tax business and you tax jobs, you'll get less of them. And when you subsidize homelessness, when you subsidize not having a job and staying at home, when you subsidize having children out of wedlock, when you subsidize all these self-destructive behaviors, you will get more of them. And that's what California has done. They've taxed productivity and they've subsidized the opposite of productivity. And that's why people are leaving there to go to states like Tennessee that has no income tax. We don't tax income here. We tax consumption. We have sales tax. So the incentives are better here for you to start a business, for you to have more like economic opportunity. It's a less regulated society, so it's easier for you to do things like own a gun and defend your family, and that sort of thing. Now that comes along with more personal responsibility, but there are always trade-offs. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's another fundamental economic principle. There's no such thing as a free lunch. You're going to have to pay for everything in some way. And so the way you pay for more freedom is with more personal accountability. And I think that's what you're seeing. And the question that you raise, like, why is all this happening and why is it happening now, is a really complex question. But there is a book that really tackles this in a comprehensive way, and I think provides a satisfying answer. And it's called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, Hoffer. And The True Believer by Eric Hoffer is just, he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was awarded by Ronald Reagan in the 80s to Hoffer. He was a brilliant, what I would consider blue-collar philosopher, just a brilliant guy, very humble. Few people have ever heard of him, but he's amazingly influential and just a brilliant dude. And that book pretty much answers your question in full. It's far more than we could get into in a podcast episode.
Okay, that sounds awesome. I'm going to read into it. When did he write this book? Relatively recently?
No. Hoffer's, I think he's been dead for a while. I think it was written in the 50s, 60s. I'd have to look it up. But okay. I read it a few years ago for the first time. And I started, it was so moving. And so I was like, oh my God, this is super relevant to everything that's going on right now. Like, where has this been all my life? And I started posting quotes of it on Facebook. And one of my buddies from law school goes, that's my favorite book ever. Like, I'm so glad that you're reading that. That's really good. He was like, how relevant is this to today? And I said, super, super relevant. Like, it basically is a perfect explanation of everything that's going on right now.
Okay.
It's a treasure.
I love to learn more about that. I feel and I think every state in the US and places in the US has a slightly different strategy about that. But we feel that there is definitely a strong change in how big parts of society have moved. And what I've realized, there is this argument, and I think it's somewhat libertarian, that goes, well, if everyone else just goes crazy, I go somewhere where people are not crazy, right, so to speak. So I kind of withdraw from that part of society. I tell them, if you want to drop out of the US, you're good to go. But obviously nobody wants to, because the Fed prints all the money. So nobody really wants to drop out of the union right now, because we all want that sweet money that seems to be free. So that's never going to happen. And the problem with that perspective, I was pretty much on this for the last couple of years. I would say, well, we don't need the dollar anymore. We just go Bitcoin. And if you have the dollar, that's great. If we don't really need to worry about these people, so to speak. We just build a wall, so but it can be a mental wall. It doesn't have to be a real wall, right? So anything that they feel there isn't enough value to stay in a useful collaboration, we just shut ourselves off. But what I've learned relatively recently, I've changed my mind on this. And I felt when you think about the dollar is maybe in trouble, but it's relatively easy to fix. It's not a really tough fix. Most cities in the US seem to be pretty desperate in certain areas, but it's not a really difficult fix if we all pull in the same direction. And there is 100% on anything, of course, but there is a certain way we can find solutions in the middle. We've been doing this for so many hundreds of years in the US. I feel there is a larger picture that people that are libertarians kind of shut out, and I think it's not healthy. It's a bit like saying, you know, we don't really need roads because there's some people out here who don't like a road to be built. So what we do, we all just get a pickup truck and we just leave the dirt road because it's too difficult to even make it a road. Or we don't build.
Or we privatize the road like they did in Indiana. They privatized huge sections of the interstate there, and it was phenomenally successful. I don't think that the libertarian argument is.
It's not necessarily the money argument. It's also that people obstruct the road construction sometimes.
But the libertarians don't want to obstruct the development of infrastructure. They just don't want to be forced to pay for things that are not really public goods. And roads aren't the best example because they are public goods. But no, there are lots of things that go.
My argument is that you have to put all that effort into persuading people and keep trying. Because without society and putting big parts of your society behind you, the game's already over. You cannot flourish as much as you can if you convince the rest of the society that what you have in mind is the best solution.
But how can you persuade them? Yeah, and I hear you and I agree with you, but it sort of begs the question, how can you persuade anyone if you rob them of the tools of good choice making, decision making, right? And this is well-traveled ground in this conversation alone. And you know, we've robbed them of access to philosophy. We've robbed them of access to economics in their public education.
People can get that. It's like, you know, Jesus
Christ. Well, like
Christ
you said, they're not going to get there on their own.
Because that's where the sick people are, not where the healthy people are. So he wanted to convince the most hard-nosed Jews he could find and make sure they know about what his power is, so to speak. And I think this willingness to convince other people is a bit of the problem. I mean, on the woke side, they want to convince a lot, but they don't want to talk because they feel like, whoa, can we really hold it up?
They don't want to convince. They want to coerce. They don't want to convince. That's why they can't. That's why they have cancel. Yes. That's why they have cancel culture. They're not out to convince you. Convincing you requires you to persuade them. They'll convince you in the re-education camps that they want to send you to. I mean, that's. You know, you'll have to apologize to death and you'll get canceled. You'll lose your livelihood and everything if you're not woke. And that's the danger of not being woke.
But free people will never elect that. I mean, maybe, but they will regret it pretty quickly. Free people.
Well, we just did. We just did elect that. We just did at a federal level.
Woke.
No, but I would call Kamala Harris. She's definitely part of the woke elite. Yeah. And I think Biden. Yeah, but Biden's a Trojan horse. He was. Look at him. I mean, he's falling up the stairs, getting on Air Force One. The NRA's out there publishing ads like, "You'll never get our guns because we keep them upstairs." Ha ha ha. You know, like he's a joke, and everybody knows that he's a joke, and everybody knows that he's probably not going to survive his first term in office. And then Kamala Harris will be president. And you know, it's a Trojan horse administration, and everybody knows it. Nobody wants to talk about it because it's super uncomfortable. But I don't think Biden's really a factor. I don't think he's really running his administration. He's not an intellectual leader. He's a puppet. He's a very obvious puppet. He's basically the equivalent of a houseplant.
Yeah, I think we can all kind of see these main threats out there, but there is a larger duty, I think, for us as citizens is to convince and constantly persuade people. And if for some reason we don't succeed, we shouldn't just retreat and say, "Oh, well, then I'm just going to go where the people are like mine," because that's, I feel, the mistake that we attribute to woke people, right? If they don't, well, we don't say we have to go to the gulag, but we would say, "Well, I'm just never going to talk to you again," or I restrain my communication. Let's put it this way. Yeah, and I think that's not it's not good for this country, and it's something that changed me, where I felt, you know, there is a lot of common ground, and it might be really uncomfortable to get there. But I think the common ground is 99% when you go down to the actually specific issues, right? Do we need to give money to people who are in need that are on the streets? Yes. I think everybody says yes. How do we do it and how do we enforce it? And then what do we do that people don't go crazy? Well, that's a slightly different story, but we need to help them. If this money comes out of a
voluntarily
religious institution or not,
yeah,
maybe that's
exactly. Religious institutions, I think voluntary charity is only charity if it's voluntary. And I think that giving voluntarily to help people is real virtue signaling. You brought up Jesus, right? What did Jesus say? Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, render unto God that which is God's." In other words, pay your taxes, meet your civic obligations, even if you are oppressed, which, by the way, the Jews at the time of Christ were severely oppressed and treated as second-class citizens by the Romans. In fact, a Roman soldier or a Roman citizen walking along the road, if he encountered a Jew, could tell him, you have to walk with me and carry my burden for 1 mile. And what did Jesus say? He said, go the extra mile, go, don't just walk with him, don't accompany him 1 mile and carry his burden, go a second mile. That was beyond the legal obligation of the time, but it was an expression of charity and concern for what the Jews at the time considered an enemy. It's part of what Jesus taught of love your enemies, but he also taught us to give charitably to those who are in need, to take care of people. He didn't say pay taxes and push for higher taxes so the government can do it for you. Charity is supposed to come directly from us, not from the government.
But you know that atheists have the same religious instinct. They have the same exact expectation as everyone else who believes in a more common religion.
Yeah.
But they don't have the means. Right? They're giving people money. There is no function for this. There's no method. So their method is giving money through the government.
There's tons of 501c3. I don't buy that, frankly. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but honestly, look around. How many 501c3 nonprofit organizations that are not faith-based charities exist? And really, take a walk in San Francisco to stuff your pockets with cash or coupons for fast food restaurants or whatever you want, and just start handing it out to bums on the street. I mean, that's taking care of your fellow man.
Oh, people do that. That's why in all the rich neighborhoods.
Yeah, great.
They're never, there's a sleeping neighborhood and then there's a neighborhood where you go during the daytime to collect some money. This system is in place. So I feel if we go down to how we live our lives and how we think about that, and I was talking to Jim Rudd yesterday, who is a very strong atheist, and I was trying to convert him to the utility of religion, so to speak, which I didn't succeed. I didn't get anywhere. But I think this is an argument where people listen. People listen to what does religion actually deliver, and I think that's misunderstood. And I think this is a problem. Religion has been so old that it kind of doesn't explain itself so well anymore to people who are not already believers, because it doesn't have to, but because it has massive amounts of believers, and it's like, well, we really don't care so much about the next group of new believers.
Well, individualism,
especially Judaism.
The failure of individualism and the failure of religion kind of go hand in hand. And I'm not talking about individualism in a healthy general way, but I'm talking about radical individualism and what in the early part of the 20th century the Roman Catholic Church called the heresy of Americanism. You can go and look this up, that Americanism is considered a heresy by the Catholic Church. It doesn't mean that the Catholic Church is...
Right, obviously, yeah.
Right. It doesn't mean the Catholic Church considers America to be heresy or the idea of America to be heresy. Instead, it's this radical, what they called Americanism is this radical, hyper-individualistic, myself before all other people kind of approach, right? And when you started to see at least Christian religion decline was in the 1500s under Luther, Ulrich, and Zwingli, Martin Luther, Ulrich, Zwingli, and John Calvin. So it's Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli. These were the three major leaders of Protestantism. And Protestantism has baked into the cake the atomization of society. Every single new Protestant denomination is predicated on separation from a preceding Protestant denomination. So how are new denominations born? They separate, they come up with some theological dispute or distinction or difference or political dispute or difference with their predecessor, and they separate off. And so it's just, constant division and constant atomization. And in the United States, that religious and cultural ideological foundation was also the foundation of our political structure. We don't have one unified government. We do kind of under the federal government, and that's much stronger after the Civil War, but we still have 50 individual sovereign states, 50 laboratories of law, 50 different regulatory structures, 50 different legislatures, 50 different judicial systems. Right? Everybody's different. They're all pretty individualist. If you don't like California, you can move to Tennessee or Wyoming or Montana or wherever, right? You can go somewhere else. And different states have varying degrees of success. On one hand, I think California's economy is something like the 8th largest economy in the world by itself, right? But on the other hand, people are fleeing in droves because of the crushing tax burden and insane government and overregulation. It's phenomenally successful on one hand and a dismal failure on the other, just depending on which axis you're looking at. Social,
California
economic.
has figured out how to be successful without a government. It's kind of like when you go to Florida, it's almost the opposite. Like the government's excellent, but the citizens, you have to look carefully to find someone you would describe as excellent.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe these things go together. And I don't know what about the relative failure of religion in the US. It's kind of funny because that's been something that's been going on in Europe for the longest time.
Since Protestantism.
Since Protestantism, but it becomes the when you ask people, do you subscribe to a religion? This has dropped off really the last 60, 70 years. Mm-hmm. Maybe
post-Vatican II, because Protestant ideology started to infect and really Masonic thought, and there's we're just getting borderline conspiracy theory territory here, but you look at what led up to the ideological changes in the Catholic Church that led up to Vatican II, and you see the changes that were wrought by Vatican II. Even though dogmatically nothing changed, the way dogma was distributed and taught, sort of through the liturgies in the church and all of that in the Catholic Church, that significantly changed with Vatican II. And so it's sort of
hang on, no. But what I wanted to get at is that the U.S. is,
but it's the same thing
of states. Maybe I don't get it, but what I wanted to say is there's a marketplace of states, right? So we figure out what's best in the U.S., and I think everyone's trying to copy that from us, and some get it right and some don't. But we also have this marketplace of religions. We're pretty unique in the world, that we have a pretty widespread marketplace of religion. So we should do better than others. So religion should be more successful because of the built in the U.S. And it used to be,
we don't really have a big market because most of it, up until, for years, it was illegal for Catholics to even own land in the United States. Even though there are a lot of different religions in the United States, the vast majority of them are anti-Catholic. And I think that Catholicism, and the reason I'm kind of hammering this point and we started talking about Vatican II, is I really do believe that anti-Catholicism is dangerous, because whereas Protestantism has baked into the cake division and the atomization of social structures, whether they're families or churches or larger social groups, Catholicism has a unifying effect. And it's like the opposite of Protestantism, in that the word Catholic comes from the Greek katholos, which means universal. It's the universal church. It's meant to wrap everybody up in this one church, this one body, and really bring them all together in a unifying way. And that's what's healthy for society. What we're seeing in the atomization of society, people sort of dividing off into their own echo chambers, not really trying to persuade others. I think that comes from a deep ideological root that is intrinsically tied and inextricably bound up with Protestantism. And I think a more Catholic approach would be healthier for society that needs unification right now, not division. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know enough to to be honest about the specifics, I've studied the text pretty intensively, and I went through all the big 3 books of the New Testament. It's a little smaller, fortunately. It's easier to read. And you can say that the Catholics would make the same claim, or the Jews would make the same claim about the Catholics. And, Muslims make a similar claim to other people of the book, and especially infidels, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure this is really unique to Catholicism or Protestantism. Maybe it is. I actually don't know enough about the specific differences. And, there's Orthodox Church, which was around at the same time. So it was a strong competitor for the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was more organized, was more Roman. And the Orthodox part was more religious, so to speak. That's why it's called Orthodox. And it had slightly different opinions. But in the end, they came out relatively similar.
The difference was political.
Took off as much.
Yeah, the difference was largely political up until 1000, almost 1100 AD, when there was a big for political reasons, basically the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, excommunicated some of the patriarchs in Constantinople, and so that's where you started to really see a schism politically, and the division of the church as a institution. But what's interesting is that from a dogmatic standpoint, the Orthodox Catholics and the Western Catholics, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, really believe the same things. I mean, there's a bit of a difference when it comes to can priests be married at at a certain point, and things like that. There are some minor differences in the way it plays out doctrinally, but from a dogmatic standpoint, which is where the rubber meets the road, they're effectively still the same. They're both Catholic.
Yeah.
And I was raised fundamentalist evangelical Protestant Christian in the Southern Baptist denomination. My parents were charismatics. And although my dad at least might resist that label, they both were charismatics, kind of Jesus people in the 70s. And so I was raised up with that, and had to memorize the Bible from a very young age. And so I've memorized large chunks of the Bible. I went to seminary for a year. I went to a Baptist seminary. But then in 2013, I converted to Catholicism because I was just grieved by all the division in Christianity. And I thought, is there a single body of Christianity that has a claim to being the true church that could actually unify all these disparate denominations? Division is a big problem for me. Ideological division, political division. I don't like things that divide people, because even though I'm a libertarian, like you're saying, I really believe that we need to constantly devote ourselves to the hard work of persuading others, of talking to them and being compassionate and having good communication, listening. And I don't think we can do that if we're all divided along these lines. And Sir Francis Bacon wrote a wonderful essay hundreds of years ago called Of Unity in Religion. And in that essay, he talks about why unity in religion is important and why we should strive for orthodoxy in Christianity, at least. And, of course, the Jews and the Muslims and the Buddhists and the Hindus and everybody, they all have similar related thoughts and issues. But ultimately, religion, I think, ought to be a unifying force, both within the religion and then more broadly to humanity as a whole. Just because I believe in Catholicism doesn't mean that I have to hate a Muslim or a Jewish person or a Hindu or a Buddhist. I should see them as brothers in humanity. We're all the same species. We all bleed red. We all have the same needs, and I should love them. And I hope that their religion teaches them to love me as well.
Yes, I think there's always this part of religion, but you need to set a border to something you're not in order to motivate your followers enough. I think this has happened with every single religion. You come out and you
talks
say
about that.
Yeah, say Islam, it came out and said, oh, all the people of the book are our friends, right? That was the first big story, and they conquered a lot of places. A big part of that conquest was, oh, you guys going to be fine. You basically are Christians, you're Jews, we love you, we are all one cult. We all love the same God, right?
As long as you pay the tax.
But it didn't work out that way after 200 years, because you got to fortify your own base, right? You gotta make sure, okay, these people give money to me. What? Don't give the taxes and all the donations to someone else. No. I'm the right interpretation of Allah's word, and that I think this is unavoidable. Even if you start out like you would say, you start your own cult, and you say, well, this cult, everyone is welcome. Let's just assume that. you start
Yeah.
that and say we're very inclusive and everyone can stay a Christian. Like in Asia, a lot of people actually go to churches and then they go to a temple, then they go to a monastery, not a monastery, go to a mosque. And they believe in all three things kind of at the same time. They're like Buddhists too. And they're like, if you ask them, yeah, I'm Christian, Buddhist, Muslim. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm sharing my time. But sooner or later, that seems to be something that falls off these religions. They say, okay, now I've fortified my base. I want you to give me the money and the human recognition, and we're going to conquer the world, so to speak. There seems to be no way out of this. I don't know, maybe we were just too stupid 500 years ago, and now we figured it out.
I don't know. I feel like there's religion and then there's politics, right? And I think with that, what your phenomenon you're doing comes from the intersection of those two things. When you have pure religion, it's hard to have room for such terrestrial things as money and power structures and all of that. Like an actual religion is concerned with the transcendental, the things that are beyond this life, and that's the power of, for example, the Mass and the liturgy in the Mass. It's the power of the Eucharist. It's that when I receive the Eucharist into myself, and I look at everyone else around me who's also receiving the Eucharist, I recognize in a very physical and real way that what is in me is in them too, that we're bound together by that. And that transcends space and time. And it's not just the people around me there attending that particular liturgy. It's every person who's ever received the Eucharist throughout all of time. And I'm connected to all of them, all the saints, all the martyrs, every anonymous faithful Catholic that's ever lived who's received the Eucharist. We're all connected by that one ritual, that one beautiful expression of Christ and the real presence of Christ in that sacrament. And so that's a compelling thing for me. It's a transcendent thing for me. And that's what I believe religion is supposed to do. And when you start binding it up with political authority and terrestrial concerns about like money and all of that, you start to get away from, what it's all about. Even Jesus said that, don't be concerned with what you will eat or what you will wear. Don't be concerned with the things of today, because your Father will take care of you. Your Father in heaven will take care of you. He says, consider the lilies of the field. Who is better arrayed than them? Consider the sparrows. Even they have enough to eat. Have faith and don't be concerned with the things of today and this physical life. Instead, drawn to more important, transcendental things. And I think every good religion has that effect and it has that focus. And you start to see problems introduced when you start combining religion with politics and money and all of those things. That's where you start to see human corruption seep in.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. And Jesus was a bit of a hippie. We would call him today.
Or hippies took the best of Christ and adapted it for their own purposes.
Yeah. I feel there is something to hippies that's constant in time. Maybe we changed the words, but these been around forever, and sure. They always get people together, and then it goes the other way over time. But what I personally have experienced is that the power of religion, and I see this with my own children, right? So if I invoke the word of God, it is a very different reaction than when I tell them something to do. They ignore me completely. They look through me, right? When I give them, the teenagers, when I give them personal advice, when I invoke the word of God, they listen. That doesn't mean they do it, but they listen. And it's anywhere you go, the influence of religion, if you can base your argument on religion, and the wokeism has their own religion. So that's what I'm saying. They use religious instincts in the exact same way.
Wokeism is a religion. Progressivism is a religion.
And there's this. Every religion has a certain stance on weaknesses, and they work out over time. But once you invoke religion, your own personal influence on society grows so much, and you have to be very responsible about not abusing it. And I think a lot of people are, but it takes a small minority to abuse it, and then suddenly you have an army that basically goes and does whatever you want.
Yeah,
the magnitude of religion and what it does with people is pretty crazy, and people underestimate. This hasn't changed over the centuries. Like, it doesn't matter what you call it and how you define it. And some have
because human nature doesn't change. Yeah,
yes, because
some are more careful than others, but human nature doesn't change, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
There is a DNA DNA thing that makes us so vulnerable for this, because someone needs to explain us this magic that's going on out there, and then everyone has a slightly different answer for that. But we still need like some. It doesn't have to be a being, but we need an explanation for what's going on and why we are here. Unless maybe the aliens finally come down and tell us, right?
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the answers are really, I've asked you a couple of questions, but I feel like I've answered a lot more questions than I've asked. So I want to ask you, do you think that the answers are really as important as the questions?
That is a good question.
Let me put it in another way. Do you think that our society has this ironic juxtaposition between a focus on science and an obsession with knowledge? Don't you think that that's self-contradictory? Because science isn't really a source of knowledge, is it? It's just a methodology for asking better and better questions, for refining a questioning process. It's not, science isn't really a vehicle for getting answers. So don't you find that strange that we emphasize or pay a lot of lip service to science on the one hand, but we're obsessed with knowledge and answers?
Well, I feel like this desire for figuring out how the world works is part of that religious instinct. And when you go back to very successful times of scientific discovery, people were basically extremely religious and very often Catholic. So you see this in the early 20th century, you see this in the early Enlightenment. Those are driven by an extreme desire to figure out, okay, what is God up to, and how does actually God work in the relationship with Earth? And because you have to go for these extremes, you have to be out there and you have to go through a lot of knowledge, and you have to take a lot of risks, and people will not appreciate you if your scientific discoveries turn out to be false. So you don't know before you get started. We don't do this anymore. We do like these tiny layers, and that's not science in my definition. That's just bureaucracy. And the Soviet Union doesn't come up with a lot of science because it is bureaucratic, and there's no risk-taking inbuilt. So a part of religion determines a really high risk-taking of figuring out how the world works. I think this is what we're lacking right now. There's too few people doing this. And we don't need a ton of people, but we need a certain amount of super AIs, people who know lots of different disciplines and just combine it together and use their human mind to scale out of this. And yes, knowledge is important because you don't want to do what someone else has already discovered. And I think this is why we have this download of information, and it takes longer and longer to get to this point, and maybe we are 60 by the time we understand anything useful, like Confucius said. But the amount of knowledge we have to download, there is no way around this, because otherwise we just repeat what other people have discovered, which is tough.
So I guess, yes. I mean, the answer is, yeah, it's weird, right? That people are obsessed with answers when it takes so long to get them. And really, there may not be anything useful that you get out of all those answers for your own life. Don't you think that we would be better served by downgrading the value of knowledge in society and upgrading the value of wisdom? Do you think that that would be a good change, social change overall?
I would love to. I'm struggling with that question, how we really define the border between knowledge and wisdom.
Well, knowledge has a clear philosophical definition, so I can help you with this. Okay. My undergrad degree is in philosophy, so I'll tell you. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Wisdom is making good choices based on good values and principles. Like basically it's your own pursuit of making good choices and living a virtuous life. And some of that definition is objective and agreeable. Of it is large swaths of it, most of it probably is subjective. But knowledge is easier. Knowledge is a true, justified belief. We all have lots of beliefs, and we justify them lots of different ways, sometimes through reason, but more often through empirical verification of our senses. But one thing that we all lack as a species, as a finite species, is a sense for truth. And the closest that we seem to have been able to come is consistency of experience. And I don't think consistency of experience is necessarily a good proxy for truth. I don't think that that really is the same as truth, because you can consistently fool a finite creature, and what we might consistently be experiencing might not be objective reality. And simulation theory has spoken to this recently quite a lot. If you go and you look up anything about simulation theory. So it's very possible that because we don't really have a reliable sense for truth, that the only actual knowledge, since knowledge is a true justified belief that we may have, is like math and truisms, things that are true by definition. And if you take that radical skeptical approach and you say, well, the only knowledge that I really have is just mathematics and truisms, then knowledge really isn't that useful to me in my life. What is useful to me are my beliefs, the consistency of my beliefs. And so faith becomes much more important. And it's for that reason that I would argue that faith is actually the primary lens through which we all see the world as humans, not knowledge. And that science is just a vehicle for asking better questions. It's not a path to answers. It's not a path to knowledge. And so for that reason, we should focus on wisdom and not knowledge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I mean, if you define wisdom in a way that you know where you want to go, you define a goal or target, and you define that, and then you take science along the way to get you there, right? So you take other facts. But there's a couple of problems with this. One is we don't know what is really true, but it's also not required. We just make assumptions and we just layer something on top of that. If it doesn't work, then we go deeper into stack. But there's so much knowledge out there and you can't really verify. Nobody can. You need an expert. I mean, even the expert needs to take a couple of years and write some white papers, and we still don't know. Like AI, we don't know why AI works, but it works. It's really strange. It's like magic. But it shouldn't be because it's math, but it's kind of not math, right? So this math's digital idea of that we know why it works, it's out of the window with AI already, and it will get even worse and creepy with AGI. And then the other problem is the idea of wisdom is when you just define it, what is instead of you follow that ought instead of the is. Wisdom is something we often copy from other people and religions, right? Religion gives us ideas about where we should go. But we don't know if it's true either, right? So we assume it and we see if it works for us. And I think this is the right behavior. We have to assume things and just go with it. We just act it out. We are like actors in our own life, and then we see if it works for us. And if it propels us, and given what value system or like system we use to see if it actually is useful to us, we add a little more to it, become a little more radical, so to speak.
Well, yeah, wisdom is necessarily, it's the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. And I would say the least part of that is knowledge. I would say it's experience and it's good judgment. It's, the soundness of an action or a decision regarding and the application of your experiences, the knowledge that you claim, and good judgment. It's all about making good decisions, and it is heavily experience driven, but thankfully, we can stand on the shoulders of giants. We can learn from the experiences of others. And I would say that science's true value to humanity is in its failures. It's where hypotheses did not turn out. Because since we don't really have a sense for truth, and we can't say this is true because we don't have a sense for that.
Nobody has. I don't think
nobody does. No person has. Yeah, maybe not, but certainly we don't, as finite creatures, we don't have a sense for truth. And so the best thing that science can do for us is say, well, I don't know what truth is, but it's not that. That didn't pass the test. And so it's like science is great as a process of elimination for hypotheses that we have. And so we really learn far more from the quote unquote failures of science. The failures of science are really its biggest successes in that way. That it's the failures of the testing of a hypothesis that lead to the real value, the experience, and the wisdom that help us make better judgments and better decisions.
I think they are connected, but I'm with you when you say we're lacking the motivation to do something great. I think this is a failure of religion, and that was at times, at least in human history, seemed to be much stronger, at least for certain individuals. I'm not saying for everyone, and they might have had privilege, so to speak. But they came out and they changed the world. And I think we have too little of this. Fully with you.
I think we're headed back to that. The good news is, and some of the stuff we've said is it would be enough to make cynical or maybe a little depressed. But the good news is, and you touched on this when you said, I think universal basic income is in some way is a good idea. I think as we automate large sectors of the economy and we basically automate service level jobs that can be done by robots that no longer need to be done by people, I think we will both create enough economic productivity to provide a minimum like safety net for all of humanity without being authoritarian and like robbing people at gunpoint with a taxation system. I think we're going to need to switch from an income tax to a consumption tax, like the fair tax, to fund that appropriately, but and to do it the right way philosophically. But I think a UBI is part of that, and automation is part of that. And as more of our society gets liberated from the drudgery of soul-crushing work, they will be free again, kind of like the aristocrats of old, to pursue these higher existentially fulfilling pursuits.
We can all
whether
be
it's science or
philosophers,
the
right?
arts
So
or whatever.
I think that's
Right.
that's
Yeah,
pretty
I think
cool.
so.
That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's a
And I
really
think
cool
when you
thing.
look at-
It's very exciting.
Look at the process of AI. We're not just going to change the GDP by like 3 or 4%. We're going to see a 10, maybe 100x in the next 50 years, and that's just unimaginably. We can go to the stars, and it's not going to cost us anything, at least to the solar system. Maybe not the stars.
Right.
And people.
Well, cost becomes meaningless. Cost becomes meaningless whenever resources are not scarce.
Right. So if energy, I always ask this question: what do you think happens if energy would be free tomorrow? Like what could you do with this? And it's pretty amazing, right? So energy is for lots of things that we consume, energy is the main cost.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing would be something like the very speculative conspiracy theory kind of driven quantum financial system. If you've read anything about that in sort of the fringes of economic wonkiness on the internet, there's a speculative quantum financial system that could replace, in theory, our existing banking system and currency speculation and a lot of other moving the pieces around the board without really contributing anything to the production of goods and services in a meaningful way, paradigm that we have today. So a quantum financial system or something like that would unify all of the global currency and distribute the value of that in an equitable way around the world, I think would be achievable if we either produced a Dyson structure where we had limitless energy from our host star, or if we had like fusion power that was clean fusion, cold fusion, something like that. I think that those kinds of innovations definitely could open up human productivity to the point where it's virtually limitless. But I also think we need to do things like asteroid mining. There's an asteroid in the Kuiper Belt that has more gold in it than has ever been discovered on Earth, ever.
Well, it's all about
minerals
cost,
and resources.
the cost is about energy. Yeah. Once we have free energy, we can do whatever we want. And it's obviously not going to be 100% free, but it's going to be thousands, tens of thousands of times cheaper than today. What we achieved with transistors, we now have to do for energy. But if we have...
And rare earth mineral.
Yeah, and that's, that would be my other question. If the singularity is correct, in about 20 years, relatively soon, we have, for $1,000, the power of 1 million human brains. So the same computing power doesn't mean it does the same thing, but our iPhone is as smart in certain narrow fields, not AGI, in certain narrow fields as 1 million people. This power is insane. We can just redirect billions of intelligence. They're not beings walking around, right? They're not little robots that are conscious, but those are problem-solving machines, and we can set them to anything we want, and it's basically free. So once we have that means free energy will be a matter of a couple of years. That's it.
Well, I think in my lifetime, you're going to have a judge sentence an AI judge sentence a human to jail. Like you're going to have judges presiding in criminal cases. Like without I could see that happening in 20.
Without bias.
Well, unless the bias is programmed into the software, right? Like there has been a lot of concern about, and a lot of this comes from woke corners of the internet that are very uncomfortable with certain criminal behavior statistics, but they see that as like having a disproportionate impact on certain groups that they want to support their ideology, and so there's a lot of concern about whether or not there actually would be some kind of so-called systemic bias or inherent bias in the programming of of a purely analytical machine that just uses statistics and that kind of analytical reasoning to pass judgment on people. But I think nevertheless, we're going to develop artificial intelligence-driven lawyers and judges and doctors. I think doctors are going to, you're going to have robots that are performing surgery on people that are more effective, certainly have steadier hands than surgeons. I think technology is going to really change technical fields, and that includes white-collar technical work in a dramatic way, such that the contributions to material goods and services are primarily going to come from automatons, artificial intelligence, robots, and that sort of thing, more than people, and that where people will flourish and where human work will still flourish will be in qualitative ways, through philosophy, through the arts, through the development of and contributions to culture. And that's, I think the writing is on the wall right now, and that's one of the reasons that the algorithms strain so hard to control culture, because we're at a pivotal moment in history where if culture goes in one direction, it sets the tone for the next 100 years or 500 years.
No, not in America. I'm very confident Americans will make the right call. If anyone
on
globally,
this
planet, it's going to be the U.S. And we're going to be fine. And there's so much out there in new. I don't know if it's really wealth, but in productivity at least, we don't have to quarrel about these little things. That's kind of my message. There's so much out there, and all we need is some entrepreneurs. Maybe in 10 years from now, maybe not right now, but in 10 years from now, the next generation, and this thing is going to be amazing.
Well, that's why I do what I do. I want to support entrepreneurship. Like that's my whole shtick with executive LP and profit from legal is I want to foster entrepreneurship and encourage people to found businesses that are solving meaningful problems in the world. And then I want to help those businesses succeed. And I want to help them understand that protecting those fledgling enterprises, those small to medium-sized businesses, whether you have less than $1 million in revenue or, $10 to $50 million in revenue, there is a path to using preventive legal support to make your business more profitable. It doesn't just have to be a cost center. So like even in my narrow little niche field, and I'm not going to sit here and plug it, but I'm just saying that in my professional life, day to day, day in and day out, what I do every day is help small businesses succeed and use legal services. But I'm fully on board with and open to and kind of excited about the fact that technology should put me out of a job in the next 20 years. I really need to figure out something else to do, and hopefully it'll be teaching philosophy.
Not what's in your brain and what are the higher distilled thoughts of your brain, the decision-making, so to speak, right? The judgment that you make will still be necessary, but what's important is that you're going to do anything that's repetitive, you're going to put it into an AI, and the AI will pre-decide it for you. It will all look like Minority Report, so to speak, for anyone. And we already do this. If you do go on a new route in a new way in our cars, we put the destination in, and then we see the options, and we follow it or we don't follow it. And I think this is my model for the future. We get all this pre-decided models, but we don't have to go with the recommendation. We can always diverge from it, but we got to have a good reason for it. We can't just say, oh no, I didn't go on this route, and your wife won't be so happy if it takes an hour longer. Right? So you got to have.
I think that's really brilliant. I've never really thought about it working with AI like following GPS, but that's a beautiful analogy.
I think this is the easiest outcome, and eventually you just trust the GPS, and then that's a danger, of course, as well, right? So if you trust it too much, if you're local, you know better ways to get there, so you don't have to trust AI. It's kind of for the idiots, they trust AI.
Like Michael in the office where he drove his car into the lake, and he said, robots are about trying to kill you in a lake. But it was really his own foolishness for not listening to Dwight in the passenger seat saying, no, don't turn left. You can't go here. The road runs out. And he's like, no, I'm following the GPS. And he drives his car into a lake.
And there's an old wise saying that people say, the amount of problems always stays the same, irrespective of in what environment you are, because there is an amount of problems you can actually put on your daily agenda. Maybe it's a dozen, maybe it's a few dozen. But if most of your little problems are taken care of, and that's what we speak about UBI, but if you talk about other more complicated issues that are already pre-solved, then your life is going to be not necessarily easier, because I think we just find new problems we can put our minds to. So we can go to the stars. We can make everyone's life really excellent. We can live in 200 different places at once. There's incredible ways we can make our lives better already right now. There's the 4-hour work week, it's the 4-day work week.
Well, if you always have the same number of problems, you're not really making your life better, are you? You're just making your life different. You're trading one set of problems for another set of problems, and in that way, like, standards of living will increase.
Like we don't want to live like in the 16th century. At least I don't. Maybe
I don't either. Like, I prefer convenient. Yeah, no, I prefer solving higher order problems. I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs is really useful for this, where you kind of see human needs in a, and at the top is sort of like existential fulfillment, getting meaning and value and purpose in your life, and at the bottom of the pyramid is sort of like subsistence based. I need a safe place to sleep, I need food to eat, I need to stay warm, I need to be protected from natural disasters and predators, that kind of stuff. And I certainly prefer, like, some people would say, all that existential angst is really hard for me to deal with, and I don't feel well equipped to do that, but I do feel well equipped to protect myself in the natural environment and scavenge for food. They like Survivor Man and all that stuff. They like naked and afraid. And so they're really comfortable with that bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whereas I would not be. I'm happier to contend with the existential angst and to have all the lower levels of that pyramid, resolved. And I think wherever you happen to be on that spectrum of human experience, what we all need universally at every level of that is compassion, charity, patience with other people, and understanding, and the willingness to engage in a dialogue and try to understand others and tolerate them, and not just not force our views on them, not require them to use our pronouns or our language or our vocabulary, but to just say, look, you're a person at bottom, you're a person, I'm a person. I love you. What can I do for you? How can I help you?
Yeah, they say if you seek true wisdom, what you have to do, you have to seek antagonism. You have to find the people who disagree with you. And while this is very uncomfortable and is really tough, and everyone is going to be depressed after that initial debate, I think on both sides you start the things crumble, right? These walls that you put in place mentally, they will crumble. And I try to do this every day. San Francisco I'm not very aligned with the political philosophy here, so it is a challenge. But I think it's the only way. The only way to really make yourself and come to better conclusions. And I like that about Jordan Peterson. When he does his lectures for years, he said, the most important part of why I'm doing these lectures is I look into people's eyes and see if they are with me, if I'm convinced them, because there's a certain flow you get in if you convince someone. I mean, that person, you can see it. And once they get into this flow, this is something I would repeat into the next lecture. Everything else I would discard and come up with something new. And I think this is the way why he got so successful as an accident, because this is 30 years of really hardcore data collection about what is persuading. And if people would go to the same amount of trouble, I think the world would be definitely a better place, because that's, it's kind of empathy. People perceive it as empathy when once they're positively persuaded, they think, wow, you teach me something new. You taught me something new.
And, Paul Bloom wrote a wonderful book called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. And he was talking about why empathy is actually the source of a lot of problems in the world, that it's sort of this road to hell or is paved with good intentions problem, and that rational compassion is actually far more preferable and beneficial for society as a basis for things like public policy. But, regardless of whether you choose to use, empathy language or rational compassion or whatever, I think you have to do what Jesus said. It all goes back to what Jesus said about love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You have to assume that there will be people who won't get it, who are definitely going to treat you badly, that is a given, and there's no way around it. You're never going to fix that. You're never going to be able to fix things like people just being bad humans. There are bad people.
But if you're right, they will have a bad conscience most of the time, unless we go back to the psychopath.
Well, I think that's what makes them a bad person, is that they don't have what makes them a bad person is that they don't feel that. They don't have that conscience, and they don't have the proper incentives to change. And there are always going to be those people, but it's not up to us to change them or even necessarily persuade them, although that's a good exercise to do if you can. If there's a chance of persuading them, I say take that chance. Even if it's a slim chance, it's worth taking. But internally, regardless of the outcome, love others, even your enemies, and I think that is the baseline for unity. Like, that's the foundation for unity in your family, in your personal relationships, your friends, in business. If you love someone and you care about them and you acknowledge that they deserve to make a living, no matter who they are, you won't cancel them because you disagree with their politics. You won't fire them from their job because you don't like who they are ideologically. That's immoral. It's wrong.
It's it's game theory. That's this big win, I think, what Christianity had over Judaism, which was having a strong philosophy, but was a little bit erring on the side of exclusivity. And what really comes out, if you create people to be irrationally positive, you lose a lot of people because they can't defend themselves. They never fight. That was a big problem with Christianity. But what you win is that obviously someone needs to smile first in a conversation. If nobody really smiles, then you both go out of this conversation and you hate it. But if one person always starts smiling first, now we can say those are idiots, right? They're irrational beings. But actually, what it does, people reciprocate, and then you create a better society just out of this nonsense. And I think this is the same as free will. Free will is actually not being rational intentionally, and now we feel that's the belief in free will. We think it's almost genetic, but I think the religions have really given us this idea in we are this unsurmountable being that is in the image of God, right? In the image of God, we are untouchable by someone else. We should not be coerced by default, right? If we go to prison, it's still coercion. So there's limits to this. And the limits are maybe not as correct as we think they are. But what really is important is that we have this illusion of free will, even if someone can prove 100% mathematically it doesn't exist. And I think people are working on this, a lot of atheists, because they feel we've been drawn into this illusion. But I think it doesn't matter, because what only really matters is, do we think we have free will, and do we behave as we would have free will? And that's all there is to this part of game theory. That's what makes us a better being, because we think we are a moral agent and we should make moral decisions. If we feel we're animals, it's just instinctive, we make moral decisions for society as a whole. And that's, I think, what atheists don't get.
Yeah, I think principles drive all of that behavior too, and it's the principles that shape who we are and what our behavior is. And I just think about St. Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, if you're, who was the chief legal mind under King Henry VIII. And when Henry VIII separated the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, because the Pope would not grant him an annulment from his Catholic wife, Catherine of Aragon. Aragorn's from Lord of the Rings. Aragon is the place where Catherine was from. But when he wouldn't grant an annulment so that Henry could divorce his wife, Henry kind of went woke. Henry got all woke about it. And he was like, you have to agree with me. We're going to have our own church. You have to agree that I'm the head of the church and that it's right that I divorce my wife. And I mean, that was wokeness. Henry VIII was one of the big woke guys of history, right?
Okay.
And so
I never heard about that.
I mean,
interesting.
Yeah. So there's a great movie called A Man for All Seasons that's about St. Thomas More's life. And Thomas More said no, he was a faithful Catholic going to rubber stamp what King Henry wanted. And even though they were friends, they were close political allies. They were friends. They were simpatico. And from a dogmatic standpoint, they agreed about virtually everything. But, for political and personal reasons, they had this big rift between them. And ultimately, King Henry VIII sentenced, sorry, spoiler alert for the movie, but King Henry VIII, this is sort of a historical fact, so you've had several hundred years to learn it. I don't feel bad about the spoiler. Henry sentenced St. Thomas More to death. And before the headsman's sword came down on his neck, he said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." And I think we all have to make these choices about which principles have priority and what matters the most to us. And that's where I think divisions will always happen. But, I think St. Thomas More died loving Henry VIII. I think he died his good servant, loving him and wishing that things were different, forgiving him. And not even at the cost of his life, he wasn't going to compromise his principles, but that also did not compel him to hate the person who sentenced him to death. And I think that's a great model for all of us today when we're in the face of woke culture and we face cancellation for unpopular opinions or whatever the case may be. And I think it may get worse before it gets better, but the answer is always love. Love everyone, even your enemies. Be compassionate, be kind, curse you, pray for those who despitefully use you. I mean, the answers are there for us, but it's it's very simple, but it's very difficult. Usually the simple things, and you've said over and over throughout all of this conversation that some of these solutions are simple. They're not complex solutions, but some simple things are very, very, very difficult. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
Well, I think what you say is very wise. And one thing that people, I think they haven't analyzed enough is I feel like the religion is an error correction on Adam Smith's visible hand, what it does to humans. So for the economy, Adam Smith works well. I don't think there's much error correction to be done. You can talk about modern monetary theory and there is maybe some edge cases, but generally I feel it works like magic. And nobody really knows how it works. It's this huge distributed supercomputer like the universe that someone must have built, or maybe it's all just randomness, but it seems to be extremely well built and designed and efficient. And what happens with the humans is there's this invisible hand that generally drives us, where we think someone in a relatively small case scenario is the right thing to do. We want to optimize for self-interest, right? We want to survive. We want to be nasty to other nasty people. We do a lot of things given by our animal brain that we maybe that feel good to us in that moment. Like this, we can talk about the sins, but I think the real strength is that we have this error correction in religion. And people,
well, Judaism was the first big error correction in that way, right? The old admonition, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, was a limiting principle. It was to prevent the escalation of retribution, and it was saying, look, if someone costs you an eye, don't take more than an eye in retribution. That, you're right. Religion in that sense was literally a limiting principle and a correction. And I think that building on that tradition, it still is. Yeah.
Yeah, but people they're not aware of it enough, because we are in these boxes of, we just live out what religion told us. And now we kind of wake up and people feel deceived. And I think this is the persuasion that we need to do.
Yeah, Ryan Fournier, I think it was, said that we have been taught that it's impolite or to talk about religion and politics, and I think that's what he said. We've been taught not to talk about religion and politics, but what we should have been taught, or no, he said being taught to avoid talking about politics and religion has led to a lack of understanding of politics and religion. What we should have been taught was how to have a polite conversation about a difficult topic. That's the quote. It just came to me.
That's
so
a wonderful way for the end
it's
of our conversation, because I think this is what we tried today, and maybe we
totally. Yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion. And while it's not 100%, profit from legal themed, and that's really what my podcast tends to be about, I think it does have a lot of relevance to my audience, because it's human, right? It's a human conversation, and even though it's pretty big picture, it's not really like boots on the ground practical tips. It's still a really profitable conversation in the second definition of profit, which just is generally like beneficial or useful for a particular purpose. And the purpose here would be how to live your life well and get more meaning and value and purpose out of everything that you do every day.
I would get that, Noel. Thanks for doing this. I think it was awesome, and I learned a lot of new things.
Thanks, Torsten.
Really appreciate it.
Hey, stay in touch, man. Let's hang out virtually again and do another chat sometime. I really got a lot out of it.
I would like that.
Thanks, bud.
No,
take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.